record that. Excellent. So I'm going to introduce Elizabeth Heyer. Elizabeth is the Vice President of Two Life Communities and has more than 35 years of nonprofit and public sector experience in affordable housing development, planning, policy, and advocacy. Since joining Two Life in 2014, Elizabeth has led the organization's growth, I can't even read today, I apologize, has led the organization's growth in an innovative agenda, developing and modernizing over 1,200 subsidized apartments, launching a new middle market product called Opus, and integrating healthcare programs and financing with Two Life's housing agenda. Prior to joining Two Life, Elizabeth served as the Associate Director of Public Housing and Rental Assistance for the Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development, where she led gubernatorial initiatives to preserve and reform the state's public housing system and provide housing first alternatives to shelter homeless families. Elizabeth's housing career began in 1986 as a community organizer, where she led local, state, and national efforts to preserve expiring use subsidized housing. She went on to earn a master's in urban planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, then worked as an associate director of real estate development at the Jamaica Plain Neighborhood Development Corporation. Elizabeth lives in Newton and currently serves as the chair of the Newton Housing Partnership, which advises the mayor and city council on affordable housing policy. Elizabeth also serves on the board of the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, otherwise known as CHAPA, our friends. So Elizabeth, thank you so much for coming. We've been really interested in trying to better understand development, and particularly nonprofit development. And you at Two Life, you all have built some really interesting and important projects. So we are sort of interested to hear just really what you look for in projects, how your projects are financed, how you come about building projects, and we probably have a ton of questions for you. So thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Very, very happy to be here. And I have to say, having started in this world as an advocate, I just, I'm first and always an advocate, and it really just gives me so much joy to talk to other advocates out there who are trying to make what's hard possible and what's important, really important, come to life. So really appreciate your work and the chance to talk today. So, and I should say I didn't do the icebreaker, but I can say that I, like Alan, grew up in the Midwest. I actually grew up outside Cleveland in one of the eastern suburbs, and my dad was a residential architect. So so we lived in a kind of small. They bought it, I think, when I was like 6 weeks old, and it was a fixer-upper. So my greatest memory is our house was always in construction. My dad, did all the work himself, and it was really a wonderful community and wonderful place to grow up. And I suppose it's not entirely a coincidence that I work in housing, given that my dad was a residential architect and also kind of a planner in some of the neighborhoods in Cleveland. So I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But anyway, I have some a slideshow and some remarks prepared. But I know you have a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to not talk too terribly long, because I'd really much rather focus on what you're interested in. And so the presentation that I have is just sort of a quick introduction to Two Life Communities, where I work now, and a little window into kind of how we approach senior supportive housing, which is just one piece of the housing sector. But I've had my toe in development in Jamaica Plain, worked on a lot of family housing. I worked in the public housing system as well. And I'm kind of embroiled now with the partnership in zoning reform and in Newton and the MBTA Communities Act as well. So I'm happy to go whatever direction you want to go, but my slides are mostly about, at the moment, senior supportive housing, because I am working at Two Life Communities. We're a affordable housing developer, owner, property manager, and service provider for housing for low-income seniors. So I'll spend, I'm hoping 10 or 15 minutes kind of giving you a window into Two Life, and then we'll stop and you can take this whatever direction you want to take it. Does that sound good? Great. So let me screen share. Can you all see this?
Mhm.
Okay, great. So, oops, let me just figure out how I can advance here. There we go. So Two Life Communities is everything that we do is about bringing purpose and joy to older adults, and particularly older adults who are really left out of the market. And we would say by doing sort of both market analysis and understanding the demographics and the economics, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, that at least 60, if not 70% of older adults in Massachusetts need some form of either housing supports or economic supports just to age well, because we look at it very comprehensively. It's not just for us about housing, it's about purpose, engagement, having the right healthcare, and the right connections in community to thrive and live well. And a big part of what we do, in addition to kind of, as I said, developing, owning, doing the property management services, that we also do a lot of advocacy, both around resources and development strategies to be able to replicate what we do, but also advocacy around changing the conversation about aging. We call what we do aging in community, which is very purposely in contrast to aging in place. And what the reason we call it aging in community is that the aspect of community living, that sort of connection to others and sharing your life with others, is brings so much health and wellness, and it's also a very efficient and affordable way to live. And that we are really trying to change the dialogue. So much of the kind of ethic in America is age in place. That's successful. Pull up your bootstraps, go it alone, age in place. I'm not going to leave my house, and I failed if I have to leave my house. And we want to change that to actually choosing community as success, aging in place and choosing to share your life with others and to live in a kind of vibrant community where you can have those social engagements, and so much more opportunity for economic security for older adults is something that we want people to choose. So Two Life Communities, we've been around for about 65 years. We, at the moment, have almost 14,000 apartments, but we've got, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, almost 1,000 units in our pipeline. And so we're growing very rapidly to meet the tremendous need. Our current median income of our residents is $12,000 a year. And we're able to provide affordability to people at that low income because 83% of our apartments have project-based vouchers, PBVs, so that in addition to the subsidies we get on the capital side to construct our buildings, we also get ongoing operating support, both from the state and the federal government. And we can talk more about that. At the federal level, it's Section 8. At the state level, we're one of the only states in the country that has a state version of Section 8 called the Mass Rental Voucher Program vouchers. And so 83% of our apartments have that ongoing operating support, which means that we negotiate our kind of operating cost standard with the government. And then the residents who live with us only pay 30% of their income for rent, regardless of what their income is. And the government pays us the balance of what it costs to operate the housing. And we also very much advocate that operating cost standard, that cost, that monthly cost, that annual cost to do the property management and pay the debt and keep the buildings in good condition in a senior housing setting should also really include the cost of services. And it doesn't fully do that. So Two Life also raises a lot of money. We raise about $2 to $3 million a year through philanthropy to supplement the programs and services, because most of the resources we get are dedicated to the housing side. So, and we'll talk more about that later, but thinking more comprehensively, especially when you're talking about more vulnerable populations, about the cost of housing and services, is a really important perspective. So on the senior side, Massachusetts is actually the most expensive state to age in this country. Economic insecurity among older adults is highest in Massachusetts than any other state. And we believe that's very much because of the combined high cost of housing and care here. We also have the fourth highest disparity between white older adults and older adults of color. I think it was mentioned that through the GI Bill and kind of historic housing policy that in particular black families have been kept out of the home ownership world, which is the primary way people build assets or build equity over time, which is really reflected in the disparity between, that housing discrimination is so much at the core of that disparity. We also are a state with the second highest per capita nursing home placement in the country. And again, that's not because older adults in our state are more frail. It's because they can't afford to get their housing and their care in other settings because of the combined high cost of those things. So people are driven in Massachusetts to nursing homes for economic reasons in this state, not because they need care. And I'm happy to talk more about that too as well, but there's a lot of work going on to really look at the intersection between Medicare, Medicaid, and senior housing, and how we more smartly take care of people in a housing setting, which really reduces the need for emergency room visits, unnecessary hospitalizations, and ultimately nursing home placements. As a matter of fact, at any given time, usually 30 to 40% of the people who live with Two Life communities technically are nursing home eligible based on their care needs. But because we coordinate people's access to care in their apartments and do all these other services, only 1 to 2% of people who leave us each year do so for a nursing home. Most people who live with us die with us. We have people in their 90s and 100s who live with us and receive a lot of services in their apartment. And then elder homelessness is on the rise, both because of housing costs, but also just generally the growth in the boomer population. So there's more people who are constrained by the economic insecurity of living in Massachusetts. As a matter of fact, the number of homeless older adults, people over 60, 65 in the next decade is predicted to triple. So it's something that we really need to get ahead of. So I just wanted to give you a little image of the wonderful people and the joy that people have living with us. And, knowing that the greatest driver of elder economic insecurity is housing, combined by the expensive private pay home care, we really focus on keeping people housing secure and then bringing them out of their apartments and into community for intergenerational programming. You can see for gardening, we have parties and events, we have lifelong learning, we have fitness and wellness in all of our communities. And we call this, as I mentioned, aging in community. It's a resident-centric housing model. At the heart of it are our resident service coordinators. We actually have paid social workers at the ratio of about 1 to 100 of everybody who lives with us. And their job is to make sure that people come out of their apartments and engage in all the programs and services that we offer. But a couple of other core features to aging in community. One is that at the very top of this chart, you can see we have 24/7 in-house people on site who respond to emergencies. So if someone in our housing pulls their pull cord, it goes to our people first, and 92% of the time we resolve it without ever calling 911. if you call 911 when you pull a pull cord, they're actually required to take you to the ER, which is not good for older adults. They, typically tend to decline when that happens. So, and it's typically I'm scared. I need to use the bathroom in the middle of the night. I don't know how to turn the light on. Can you help me? It's those kind of things. And then we also cross train all of our people, including our maintenance folks, to understand how to recognize things like people who are starting to experience dementia, or if there's trip hazards in an apartment, all those kind of things that keep people living with us longer. So as I mentioned, very few people who live with us ever go to a nursing home. As a matter of fact, HUD did a study a couple of years ago, which looked at the age people leave senior housing for a higher level of care, because and I'll show you some pictures, but we have full kitchens, bathrooms. It's apartment living. It's not it's not a medicalized model, but nationally people leave senior housing for a higher level of care, subsidized senior housing nationally at the average age of 79. And in Massachusetts, that age is 82. But at 2Life, because of all the programs and services and the engagement that we do, people who do leave us for a nursing home tend to do so around the age of 87. So we're keeping people living with us much longer than in non-supported senior housing models. And those supports, I'm not going to talk through this whole chart, and I'm happy to share it with you if you're interested after the fact. But what we really try to think about at a policy level is, where's that intersection between people's eligibility for housing subsidies and their eligibility for home and health care? Because it's that cost of health care and home care that is really expensive and drives people, as I mentioned, unnecessarily into nursing homes. As a matter of fact, people who have to buy home care have to do it in usually 3 to 6 hour increments, and it costs about $30 an hour to buy that. So, and people typically need, I think 80% of older adults will need some home care at some point in their life. And so if you're poor, but not eligible for home care, what drives you into that nursing home is not being able to afford it. And the reason that I wanted to show you this chart is you can see that red box there. So we call this the red box slide. And that red box represents the income eligibility for the low-income housing tax credit program, which is the primary driver of subsidies that we use to produce affordable housing. And you can see the kind of halfway down this slide, the boxes that are blue but are white in the middle. Those are all the home care programs that the state and federal government offer. So anybody who's eligible for low-income housing tax credit housing they're poor enough to be eligible for housing subsidies, but over income to receive any subsidized long-term services and supports. So how we kind of align those things is really important. But the other point to make is that the low-income housing tax credit program was actually developed for working families. It wasn't developed to build senior housing. And so the eligibility for low-income housing tax credits, people have to earn between 45 and 60% of the area median income. And you can see for an individual, that's about $47,000 a year. Well, that is higher than anybody would get on Social Security. The maximum Social Security, if you fully paid in or are drawing the highest amount, the most you're going to get annually is $40,000 a year. So if you don't have some assets or some savings to supplement your Social Security income, you are over income for low-income housing tax credit housing, which is why we need those project-based subsidies on top of the low-income housing tax credit program to get the affordability to work for low-income seniors. So this is a huge advocacy issue for 2Life and in the housing world, is trying to improve our housing policy. So when we build senior housing, it's actually affordable to the vast majority of seniors who need it, who are hugely under income for low-income housing tax credit housing. As a matter of fact, we just did some data analysis and found out that in Greater Boston, only 6% of the older adult population falls into that low-income housing tax credit eligibility criteria. The vast majority are lower than that. So it's a huge policy problem. Oh, just a quick snapshot, and I'm almost done here. I promise we'll kind of open this up for conversation, but these are projects we're working on. We're working in Lynn, we're working in Waltham, about to start construction on this new project in Waltham next to the senior center. We're working on a really exciting intergenerational village in Mattapan. Happy to talk about that as well. Actually, one of the buildings we're going to be building in Mattapan, we call Treehouse, and it's going to pair older adults with families who are adopting kids out of the foster care system, with an intentional intergenerational aspect to that community. So very exciting. And then in the lower left-hand corner, we're working on Opus Newton, which is our first unsubsidized but middle market project. And I've got a couple slides on that in a minute to talk about what we're doing there, because at Two Life, we worry about everybody who is left out of housing, and probably, 30 to 40% of them fall into this middle market category, which is over income for any subsidized housing, but not nearly enough income and assets to afford most of the market rate senior housing that's on the market today. So we, as I mentioned, engaging vibrant spaces, indoor and outdoors, very welcoming lobbies, so that people feel like they can come out of their apartments and sit in beautiful spaces and enjoy being with others. We pay a lot of attention to courtyards and accessibility of landscape and spaces. Our apartments, as I mentioned, are full service apartments. We have a adaptable design practice where 100% of our apartments are what we call adaptable. So they go above and beyond the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, so that we can make changes as people age and their physical or cognitive needs change. So roll-in showers in every single apartment. You kind of can't see it looking in the kitchen, but the countertops come out easily from under the sink, for instance. So if someone has a wheelchair or a walker and needs to be able to roll under or get under a sink, we can easily remove that cabinet. Our bathrooms have full blocking behind the walls, so we can put a grab bar anywhere, regardless of your height or need. So within the senior housing space, thinking about adaptability so that no one ever has to move because their physical needs change over time is something that's really important to us. This is just a little bit more of a close up snapshot of some of the projects we're working on. We're developing these apartments, as I mentioned, in Mattapan. It's a really exciting intergenerational village, but you can see in the subsidized world, with good architecture and really careful planning, you can develop and build beautiful spaces, that are very high quality. I'm happy to talk about the difference between public housing and this, if you want to, because I spent 8 years working in the public housing world for the government, and it's a whole different place. I appreciate that you went to see what goes on there. The thing that's really awful about that is it's very much the same population that lives in this housing, but because this is private subsidized versus public, we as a society look at it very differently, and it's really wrong. This is a view of a project that we're building on our Brighton campus, which is our biggest campus, and this building is the redevelopment of a federal senior public housing site. It's going to be 142 new apartments, replacing 64 elderly walk-up, no elevators, not accessible, old, outdated public housing. And on the ground floor of this community, we're actually building a healthcare center. So there'll be on-site healthcare options for people living in our entire Brighton community. So really thinking about how we combine housing and healthcare, particularly in the supportive housing setting, is important. This is a building that we're working on in Lynn, Massachusetts. This is 150 apartments. That's also going to have a health center on site. And it's replacing the old Union Hospital that was torn down a couple of years ago. And an activist group in Lynn when the old Union Hospital, the partner system combined the Lynn Hospital with the Salem Hospital and abandoned healthcare in Lynn, and affordable housing advocates there did a lot of work to make sure that the site could be reused for the benefit of lower income people in the community. So we were able, through a lot of tremendous advocacy, to actually win this through a competitive RFP to redevelop it as affordable senior housing. And you can see again, I mean, this is my favorite building that we're working on. I just think it's so beautiful. And actually that I can show you, just to back up for a minute, this the view in the upper left-hand corner here, that's the inside courtyard looking at the back of that building. So really combining beautiful architecture with open space. Something that's really important. So now let's just move on to middle market for just a minute, because as I mentioned, the median income of people who live with us now with those project-based vouchers is about $12,000 a year. But there are 54% nationally of seniors who can't afford senior living as currently structured. So not only do we need to think about housing that's affordable to people who are low and very low income, but increasingly we really need to think about how we serve people in the middle. And you know that population, along with growth in the baby boom population, is growing dramatically. By the end of this decade, there's projected to be 14 million older adults who nationally fall into this middle category. And this population generally has lower overall savings. A lot of folks, needed to mortgage their homes to send kids to college, to meet kind of basic expenses. I think the average savings of older adults or families nationally is under $50,000 a year. So again, if you're retired, even if you worked hard and did everything right, your typical sole source of recurring income, because pensions are largely going away, is Social Security. So you need to have some assets to draw down on to supplement your Social Security to make it work in the long run. And with lower overall savings, fewer pensions, and more people with home equity loans, we're looking at a middle market population of folks living on constrained income with some assets, but not as much as people need to be able to qualify for the high-end senior housing that's out there. And then in addition, we have more and more solo agers, people who didn't have kids, and with especially COVID. I mean, I think this was the case before COVID, but now even more so, there's fewer caregivers as well. So the ability for people to afford to stay home and make it work is hard because resources are constrained and there's fewer people to provide that care. So what Opus does, which is Two Life's middle market project, really tries to fix what is this failed system of people with fixed income, the top chart, whose frailty is going up over time. So the cost of care and need for that care goes up over time, but they're very quickly spending down assets because of the high cost of that care. And we find also foregoing medical care or other basic needs. And so what Opus does is it really tries to delay and slow down that frailty trajectory by using community housing as an approach to wellness. And as a matter of fact, people who age in community, as I've been talking about, rather than at home alone, really benefit, their health really benefits from those social interactions. So people who live in community and have regular social interactions have 50% lower rate of dementia. And if they do get dementia, it progresses much more slowly. They have 32% fewer strokes and heart attacks. And people who have social interactions are also 60% more able to perform their activities of daily living. So it keeps people healthier and slows down the kind of trajectory of health conditions that lead to greater frailty. So we're using this social platform to delay and slow down frailty, which lowers the spending costs. And then we're using economies of scale and a really creative program model to stretch limited dollars and slow down the spend on assets so that people can stretch their assets longer and stay healthier longer. And so what Opus does is it really takes the old kind of cruise ship model of senior living and turns it on its head and really develops a model that's much more, we think, attractive also to the boomer generation. So we choose locations that are in vibrant communities where we don't have to necessarily build all of the amenities into the community. In the case of our first Opus, we're co-locating it on the campus of the JCC in Newton, and it's also next to one of our existing senior buildings where there's already a lot of program space there. So it reduces the amount of program space and cost of programs that we need to provide. We've built in this concept of meaningful volunteerism. So it doesn't mean that the volunteers who live with us are going to do the maintenance or the home care. That we're hiring professionals to do, but all the other activities and programs, things like lifelong learning, people are moving in. We're actually fully sold already. We're in construction on Opus, so we know the 174 people that are going to be living with us. There's a former choir director who's moving in, there's going to be an Opus choir. There's people who were teachers, that are really interested in doing lifelong learning classes. There's folks who are moving in who are yoga instructors who want to teach the yoga classes. So using that volunteerism and inviting people to contribute their passions and their skills to the community is a way to bring down the cost of the operations of all those programs and services. And then Opus also includes a partnership with an outside home care agency who's willing to come and provide that home care on site in small increments. So as I mentioned, typically you have to buy home care in 3 to 6 hour blocks. Well, in Opus, if all you need is a half an hour, that's all you pay for. You're not going to pay for those 3 hours to get someone to show up. So it really reduces the cost of the spend on home care. And again, as I mentioned, we use scale to be able to provide all of this. So the first Opus in Newton is 174 apartments, and there's a picture of it. So on the left of this slide is our existing Coleman House in Newton. That's one of our deeply subsidized communities. And then we're building that beautiful connector building, that 2-story building with all the glass you can see in the middle. And then the 174 Opus apartments are going to be on the other side. So it's going to be an income inclusive community with a dining program and, a fitness center and an art room and a big kind of multi-purpose ground floor with a lot of flexible spaces so that everyone is invited to come out of their apartment and join us in community. So I'll stop there and, want to open this up for conversation, but this is a quote we love to use, which, basically says that choosing to age alone is both foolish and unsustainable. And we believe we can do better. Aging is and always has been a team sport. The myth of aging in place harms people by defining the decision to share one's daily life with others as failure. And that's a quote by someone who we work with, Dr. Bill Thomas, who really focuses on the benefits of community living as a way to support health and wellness. So I'll stop there and look forward to you taking this wherever you want to take it in the conversation. And I'm happy to talk about how we subsidize all of those communities that we're building, if that's something that you're interested in learning about.
No, thank you so much. That's a great overview. And everybody who has questions, raise your hand and I'll just try to moderate the discussion. One question that popped into mind was for the Opus project. Are you means testing seniors who want to live there, or is it considered market rate, or what is that? Who gets?
Yeah, it's a great question.
So 174 people.
It's unsubsidized. So it is technically market rate in the sense that it's not regulated by the government in any way, except for the fact that we have we had to meet Newton's inclusionary zoning requirements. So we do have 9 apartments that will be means tested for people to move in and meet the inclusionary requirements. But for the balance, it's a pricing model that is targeted to support people with, as I said, constrained income and some assets. And we are not means testing people to be able to move in, but we do qualify people. So we look at people's financial profile when they want to move in. We counsel them about whether this is a good decision for them or not. So they do need to have enough income and assets to be able to afford Opus.
Well, how do you make sure that the people you're trying to serve are the ones who are getting it and not someone who could afford to live somewhere else, but just wants to live more frugally?
Yeah, no, it's such a good question. And honestly, we've been working on Opus for like 7 years. It took us a really long time to figure out how. The truth is we're creating something for people. The reason no one else is doing this is because it's financially really hard. It's risky and hard. And it took us like 7 years to really feel comfortable about the model and kind of get it designed. And as part of the program development, we really thought a lot about that. Should we actually income qualify people and do a means test? And we decided not to do that because at the end of the day, we think the product itself will invite people who are right for Opus to choose Opus. And we also felt like, especially for the first one, what was important was just kind of getting it done and proving the market demand for a model like this. It's the apartments tend to be on the smaller side. We focus more on the connect space, putting the resources in the community into that village center space, that building. And the largest apartment is 1,250 or 1,300 square feet, but half the apartments are under 1,000 square feet. So people are self-selecting, and the people who are moving in are like teachers. There's a lot of former activists who are moving in. People who, we have a librarian, so it's kind of the profile you would expect. There are some people moving in who have means, because part of it too is that the brand of Opus is, we're an organization founded and led by Jewish values, although we're, certainly arms open to all and welcome all. And I just share that because we like to say, get off the cruise ship and join the kibbutz. This is a model that's very much inspired by, come be part of this community, bring your passions and joys to the community and contribute to the community. So people are also selecting it because they want to be part of a volunteer, model. They want to live with people who care about contributing to other people. So it has self-selected, and it's highly replicable. One of the things that's really amazing about it is that we don't have to get in line for the public subsidies. Our ability to grow our subsidized portfolio is constrained by the amount of public dollars that are available to do this. So this gives us a way to build at scale. And once we really prove this concept in a couple of years by filling it up and operating it, then it becomes highly replicable. And I think we feel like it's okay if people with higher means choose this kind of community living model. That's kind of a cool thing.
No, thank you. Andrew,
Yeah.
you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Elizabeth, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much for being here. I guess I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit about how you kind of do site selection. Because Wellesley needs affordable housing because everywhere needs affordable housing. But, if I was kind of, at the decision-making table, one consideration I'd want to make is, well, maybe we can get more bang for our buck where the land doesn't cost $1.5 million an acre. So
Yeah.
I love if you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, happy to. So I would say there's sort of a general answer for all affordable housing, and then there's a little bit more of a nuanced answer when you kind of apply the senior supportive housing lens to it. So for all affordable housing, as you mentioned, it is challenging because the economics have to work. And certainly when you're in the world of competing for subsidies and, you know, working within the regulated subsidized housing world, there are total development cost limits on projects. And there are per unit limits on how much subsidy you can get. So you've got to find land that works for that equation, which can be hard. And it's particularly hard in higher cost areas like Wellesley, like Newton. So, and really, honestly, generally in greater Boston, it's pretty hard. So, you know, one of the things is focusing on public land, focusing on opportunities to partner with government to identify land that they, through an RFP, a request for proposals, or a public process, can make land available for development of affordable housing. So, you know, one of the things that the Newton House, you know, put my Newton Housing Partnership hat on for a minute. One of the things that we're doing is surveying all of the public land in Newton and trying to come up with an advocacy agenda to identify, you know, opportunities for the city to make public assets available. You know, working with the housing authority a lot, and Wellesley in particular is one of them. A lot of housing authorities have properties with excess land. So, you know, looking at working with the housing authority to survey their properties and whether they have any land that they can make available for development, and do that through an RFP. It's a little trickier because there's a lot of public bid rules that come into play when you're working in the public housing space, but it can be done. And something that some housing authorities are working on. And then the other kind of general answer to that is also working on zoning reform and doing some things that really try to reduce the risk of development, which, you know, the risk, you know, first of all, zoning reform impacts land value, right? And it's one of the reasons people argue against zoning reform. But the truth is, it does help to constrain the cost of land by making more development more predictable, which means that a nonprofit or, you know, someone that wants to get in the subsidy world, by knowing that they have an as of right project, can take more risk on bidding on that land or competing for that land when you have an as of right project, or you have the ability to do more scale. And I think zoning for more density, it's a very modest impact on land value. I think it just makes land more predictable. It doesn't necessarily lower the cost, but that predictability makes it easier for affordable housing developers to compete. When, if, you know, you've got to put down money for a land and you have no idea how many years going to have to hang on to it, you know, to get it through the zoning process is hard. So I think, and then, you know, the other sort of answer to that, I'm sorry if I'm like giving you, you know, too much here in terms of answering your question, but the other thing is really working, like Cambridge, for instance, has a housing trust fund. So they work on various ways to fund that housing trust through taxes, and they literally subsidize land purchase. And so their projects
Can I call you back?
totally break the rules of total development cost limits in the
Or call
subsidized
back,
world.
'cause I'm in a meeting.
But the city comes in with additional funding to offset the cost of the land to bring the rest of the project into compliance with subsidy rules. So using local resources to help buy land or write down the cost of land makes those projects more viable in the public subsidy world. And then I would say the final thing, when you layer on senior housing on top of it, we definitely look for either a location that's near a village or a place where you can find social connection and get social connection. Or if it's not near a village, it has to be big enough for us to create that kind of social interaction. So we wouldn't build anything smaller than 100 units in a little bit more isolated location for seniors, but we can do a project with 60 units if it's in a village, because we can utilize some of the surrounding supports and resources to supplement what we're able to do in terms of social interaction in a smaller project.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful.
Ede?
You are a wealth of information. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I'm wondering if you can address a couple of things. One is, did you read the article in the New York Times Magazine about the rental? Um, what was it? The renters utopia in Vienna?
No.
Oh, very interesting. But at any rate, they were talking about kind of the differences between about 80% of people live in subsidized housing, but what they subsidize building, not people. And
Mhm.
you seem to suggest that through the project building vouchers.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could kind of talk more about that, and is there
Yeah.
a way, because as you were saying, the land, the builders, the contractors, it's all very expensive, but we
Yeah.
don't have any way of subsidizing that or pushing that from a different perspective. And then the other question I have is, how do you differentiate what Two Life Communities does from like life care communities,
Mhm.
those places, like what is the difference there? And then
Sure.
lastly, kind of the age restriction. Is there
Sure.
age restriction in these?
Sure. Sure. So, so your first question, which was project-based vouchers, and why are those important, I think, and the difference between subsidizing the housing and not the people. So what I would say is, you especially in Massachusetts, you have to do both if you want to provide housing for people who are low or extremely low income. So, um, so we worry about people who are extremely low, which is that below 30% of median category. And just going back to my chart for a minute, let's just go get it. I can just show you right here. So on here you can see that see the across the top, the 1, 2, 3 subsidized housing, the first two, 1 and 2, are what we would say are people who are extremely low income, which are people who are below 30% of the area median income. And for an individual in Massachusetts, that's about $30,000 a year. And for a family, that's, that 30% of area median is probably more like, I want to say like probably about $50,000 a year. So the issue here is that if you, I'm just going to stop sharing this. If you just focus on capital subsidies. So capital subsidies come in when you're in development, you're constructing the community, right? And so those are subsidies that are one time, and they help offset the capital costs so that you don't need a big mortgage. So what most developers do is they borrow money, right, to build their community. They get some equity investment, but they borrow money, and then they charge really, really, really high rents because they have to pay back the cost of the mortgage, the 30-year mortgage that they have that's in place that they got to help build the community. And so what subsidized housing does is it brings in capital subsidies at the front end, so that in exchange for those capital subsidies, we have to rent to low and extremely low income people. And we have a very low mortgage, so that for operations, we don't have to pay that much in terms of debt for the mortgage. We really have to worry about the cost to operate the building. So most of the rent that we take in goes to pay for utilities and maintenance and the staffing and that kind of thing, because most of the community is built with capital subsidies up front and a very small mortgage. But the reason you need project-based vouchers is even if you had no mortgage and you got 100% of the subsidy up front to build the building, and all you had to do was operate the community, the kind of core cost for property management, even before you get to programs and services in Massachusetts, is at its lowest, probably $12,000 a year. So that's, that would be $1,000 a month, which is on the low side of the operating cost standard for housing. And People who are poor can't even pay enough rent to cover that, right? So someone who's earning 30% of median income and is only paying 30% of their income for rent cannot afford a rent of $1,000 or $1,200 a month that it costs just to do the operations, right? So it is virtually impossible economically to house people below 50% of the area median without additional subsidies, even if all that capital money came in and you did it for free. So it is fundamentally necessary to provide housing for low and extremely low income people. And then even on that scale, when you get into tax credit housing and higher, for seniors, the tax credit rent is again a subsidized rent, but for an individual, that rent is about $1,400 a month. So it's a low rent through these capital subsidies, but again, that's above what a low income senior can afford. You know, for a family in a 3-bedroom in a low income housing tax credit project, they have to pay like $2,100 a month. So it's not as affordable as you'd think. So you need that operating support on top of the capital support to make it affordable for people. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's helpful.
So your other 2 questions were age restrictions and how we different from continuing care.
Yes.
So continuing care retirement communities, first of all, they're very, very, very expensive. They're only available for the very wealthy. You move in, and typically you start in what's called independent living. And then when you start needing a little bit more care, you're required to move out of your independent living apartment and into assisted living, right? So it's like you move from independent to assisted to nursing home care, and you're paying into sort of an insured model that addresses the cost of care for that entire spectrum. And it's very, very, very expensive. And as a matter of fact, most CCRCs make their money by charging a lot on the care side for this insurance model, but you're forced to move. So you move out of your apartment and into assisted living, and assisted living apartments are tiny and they don't have kitchens. They do have a private bathroom, but you move to assisted living when you start needing some care, and then when you need even more care, they force you into a nursing home level care in a CCRC. What we do is totally different. Rather than moving through the levels of care, people stay in there. We're fully independent living. People stay in their apartments for their entire lives, and we bring the care to them. So rather than moving to get the care and paying more in the model as you move up, we coordinate people's access to care in their apartment. And most of the people who live with us who are in the subsidized category are eligible for Medicaid supports for that care. So we help people coordinate their access to that Medicaid support. OPUS, the people are over income for those Medicaid supports, which is why we have that really unique care model with small increments where that care will be available to people in their apartments. So they don't have to move to a nursing home level of care. The reality is, just like you can at home, bring in home care and then bring in hospice care if that's what you need, we help people do that in an apartment setting. So that's the difference. And then our model is for people age 62 and over. So in the fair housing world, we are allowed to do that. It's one of the categories within fair housing that is allowed within the Fair Housing Act to have dedicated 62 and over. Some communities are 55 and over, as long as you declare at the front end, which you are. It's something that's allowed within the Federal Fair Housing Act.
Thank you. That's a lot. I'm thinking we should have not had anything at the beginning of this meeting and had you present, save a lot of time for question and answers, because like I said, you're covering a lot of territory. Thank you.
Yes, I'm wondering, Elizabeth, if you could talk more about the financing. So you mentioned the getting help from Housing Trust in Cambridge. You mentioned the vouchers. What are the other pieces that you put together to finance a project?
So, it within the subsidized housing world, it all starts at the local level, right? So, the state of Massachusetts administers a number of state housing programs, and they're also the Department of Housing and Community Development is also the agency that administers a lot of federal funds also. So they have federal programs that they're the administrator for the federal government, and then they have state funded programs that they manage as well. But you can't even go to the state to start talking about getting subsidies for a project until you have control of a piece of land, until that property is zoned. Development is all local. So you need the land, you need the zoning in place, and you need a local match. So if you're in a community that has no affordable housing funds, the state will look the other way on a local match, but projects are required if there are local resources like the Community Preservation Act or a housing trust fund, depending on what community you're in. There's also federal programs that get administered at the local level called home and CDBG, Community Development Block Grant and home funding. And Wellesley, I think, is part of the Metro West Home Consortium. So there's also federal home funds and federal CDBG funds that Wellesley can access through the Metro West Consortium. And so you have to start by securing land, designing a project that fits within the development cost limit that the state puts out, and having a local match. And then what happens is once you have all that in place, you compete through a public request for proposals at the state level, and the state administers a number of capital subsidies that are state funded. Some are funded through the bond bill, so they're bond funded funds, and some are funded through annual appropriations through the state budget. So there's programs called the Housing Stabilization Fund and the Housing Trust and Housing Innovations Fund. And there's an alphabet soup of like 10 different programs that DHCD administers. And then they also administer the federal low-income housing tax credit program. And that is the key driver of all production of affordable housing. It's a program that is actually administered by the IRS. It's not administered by HUD. HUD primarily is in the public housing world, so I'm happy to talk about that too if you want. But HUD does not administer the low-income housing tax credit program. It's administered by the state and through a regulatory agreement with the IRS. And essentially your project gets eligible for tax credits depending on its eligible tax basis. It's a calculation that's used as part of development costs. And the project, if it gets a LIHTC allocation, then turns around and sells those tax credits to investors. So typically the tax credit program makes up about 60 to 70% of the capital structure of an affordable housing project. And then you try to layer on top of that the local funding through CPA or home or CDBG, and then the other state, what we call soft debt programs. They're not programs we have to pay back, but we have to stay in compliance for at least 30 years in terms of the affordability restrictions to be able to obtain those funds. So the goal is that your capital stack for your project is made up of local funds, state funds, the low-income housing tax credit program, and then the balance is typically long-term debt. And the goal is to get that debt as low as possible, because that's what is a drag on your operating budget. And you want to spend as least as you can when you're operating on debt and more on maintenance and your staffing and your programs and services. So that's why we really like to utilize as many. I mean, you can have often like 10 different sources of local, state, and federal, these soft grant programs in your capital stack. And then, as I mentioned, on top of that, you're also trying to get these operating subsidies, Section 8 and MRVP, to help write down the cost of the operations for low-income people, because they, as I mentioned, could never afford enough at 30% of their income for rent to even pay for the operations.
So I'm gonna out Alan here, just so you know, Alan's the vice chair of our Community Preservation Committee. So we definitely have those funds, and we have something that's similar to a trust. So there's some
Mhm.
things there. We historically, we feel like we don't have a lot of money, even with those two funds. It's not like we have $10 million, you know, we have little bits of millions of dollars. I guess I'm curious, when you work on a new project, do you find that who's identifying the project? Are you looking around all the time at what RFPs are out there, what's going on? Or do you have communities come to you and say, hey, you know, we're the housing trust in Wellesley and we, you know, there's an opportunity, would you work with us on it? Like which direction, or is it both?
Both. It's both. Um, I would say that that for Wellesley in particular, probably you guys thinking of, you know, doing that survey of public land, and because Wellesley's such a high land cost area, most affordable housing developers aren't going to rush to Wellesley to figure out, you know, can I do a project there? What you want to do is come up with a site where a project can happen. And so you have a Wellesley Housing Trust?
Well, it's a
Also-
Wellesley Housing Development Corporation. It predates the housing.
Oh.
But it's basically the same thing as a
Okay. And yeah, so, you know, in a case like that, you know, the trust or the municipality would identify land and do an RFP. And then affordable housing developers would respond to it. And you really want to guide the design of that RFP to meet the needs of whatever, you know, whatever, if you're trying to do family, you know, you want to define it as much as possible, what your expectations are. And, you know, if it comes with access to your CBA funds, that starts to become less risky. Or if you can do the zoning work ahead of time, to have it be an as of right project, you know, the more you can do to reduce the risk by having a known piece of land, a zoned piece of land, and a clear path to subsidies, you are going to be able to attract more developers to come and do a project. But we do both. We go out and we look for sites, and we respond to RFPs that municipalities make available, or sometimes private sellers make available. But it's hard to compete when you know, we, for instance, would never purchase a piece of land before we have all of our subsidies secured. So when we're buying a piece of land, we negotiate a purchase and sale agreement that's contingent on getting zoning, and it's contingent on securing the funding, because we don't want to be stuck owning a piece of land that's not developable, which is partly why you want to start eliminating the risks associated with doing that development.
Alan?
Yeah, I'm going to respond since you called me out. But you know, as I listen to Elizabeth, I really am suddenly aware that there are many more sources of funding that we could be applying for. I think we're going about it in the wrong way. That we're trying to get the Wellesley Housing Development Corporation to the point where they have enough money or knowledge to build a few units. It sounds like with a little guidance, we could be taking a totally different approach and in going after the big units. And I'm thinking about two sites in particular, and I'll spill the beans if you want. One is the Wellesley Housing Authority land near Barton Road, which certainly is a lot of extra land. We talked about doing a survey. We never went about it in this fashion. I mean, it was always, we went to a private developer and said, what would you do for us? We never went through a nonprofit developer and said, what do we have to do to make this possible? And the other, I was in the process of composing a letter to you about this, Ann Mara, but I'll state it up here, is I'm concerned about the Sisters of Charity. Is Sisters of Charity or Sisters of Mercy? I can't remember which.
Sisters of Charity.
Charity.
Okay, that the rezoning proposal there And I'm concerned about it for two reasons. One is that it follows the paradigm that we've always followed in the past of restricting land for multiple, really taking land out of general housing use. But it does, the proposal does call for allowing development of senior housing and affordable. I don't think it says affordable housing. I think it talks only about senior housing and nursing care housing. And I'm wondering if there's some way to turn that into a proposal to do exactly the type of thing that they're doing over in Newton. That Opus project sounds absolutely spectacular. So good work, Elizabeth. Keep it up. And how do
Well,
we turn ourselves around and do similar projects in
Yeah,
Wellswood?
you're
have a
absolutely
real
right.
impact.
The most important local thing is the land and the zoning. The money locally, it's a small piece of the capital stack. Typically it's 10-20%. So what you want to be doing is using your local resources to leverage the big money at the state level. So
Mhm.
it's just the starting place. And typically, typically in a project, the local money is, just a couple $1 million. It's not a lot. Like the project we're working on in Mattapan that is going to be 180 units. We got $6 million from the city of Boston, but it's zoned and we have control of the land.
Mhm.
It's a tiny portion. Waltham, we got $6 million for 68 units, which is a very, very, very high award because they had so much saved up in CPA because they hadn't done any for 30 years. But had we gotten 2 or 3 million from CPA, we still would have had the door open at the state to apply. So it is just the first building block, and it's more about the land and the zoning and less about the money. Now, the thing I'll tell you about the housing authority land to be careful about is that you can't go and just talk to nonprofits to get that done, because there's a whole world of public bid in the public housing world that you have to be really careful about, and anybody you talk to gets conflicted out. So you can't predetermine who's going to get it. So don't talk to, if the best way to do it is do an RFQ, a request for qualifications for developers, like put your concept out and do an RFQ. Then you pick a partner based on the type of developer and a developer with the capacity that you want. And then once they're picked in a public bid process, then you can dig in with them and work on the actual details of the development project. But if you came to Two Life and said, we want you to advise us and help us think about the feasibility and the design and what the cost would be to do a project like this, and we gave you that information, we'd be conflicted out from being able to bid. So just work with the housing authority, and there are people who work at DHCD, Department of Housing and Community. They just got renamed. It's now under the new secretary. It's the
EOLHC.
EO. I'm so not used to it.
Sorry,
Livable
EOHLC.
communities. Housing and livable communities. They have a whole department of people that administer the public housing program, including a mixed finance developer who specifically works with housing authorities that want to leverage land for affordable housing development. And they will advise the housing authority and you on the way to actually make that land available so that you're not violating the public bid laws, but you're still able to accomplish the mission goals that you have for the project.
So unfortunately, we're out of time, and I really appreciate Elizabeth, you staying for an extra 5 minutes. This has been really, I think, eye-opening for a lot of us. Alan, thank you for even just saying that right out, because this is a different approach. And I will just a teaser that Sisters of Charity, I think I mentioned to you on the phone, but it's like 14 acres of land, and it's already senior housing, and they want to maintain that. So it's, but it's not, it's privately owned, right? So it's owned by sisters, and Anyway, well, I'm wondering if you would be available for follow-up. I follow up.
course. I'm
Okay.
happy to come back too, if you want to talk more.
And somebody who wanted to be here today but couldn't is Barbara McMahon, who works with Alan on the Community Preservation Committee. So she's the one I recorded this for. So I think
Oh,
she'll
great.
watch the recording and she'll say, oh, I have all these questions. So it would be great if we could set up something. So
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's really, like I said, it's just so wonderful to connect with people who are doing this work and doing it as volunteers. Like props to you guys for leaning in and working on this. It's really fabulous, very inspiring.
well, thank you for being out there and actually creating housing. Neat
Yes.
housing.
Yes.
It's really good.
Absolutely.
So
Thank
awesome.
you so much.
Thank you.
Great. All right. Take care.
Have a nice afternoon, everyone.
too.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.